weekend. What else is pretty cool? Friday night college basketball and a blue blood battle in Bloomington inside Assembly Hall. Of course, a lot going on right now with IU. They're going to need a new head coach at the end of this year. Mike Woodson is stepping down. A lot of Bloomington, Indiana focused on a native of Bloomington. That would be a certain man by the name of Brad Stevens, who currently is the front office exec of the Boston Celtics. But even with all of that, Joe, and the chaos outside of the basketball court, Indiana, huge upset. Double-digit dog on the road earlier this week, Tuesday night in East Lansing, knocking off Michigan State. UCLA continues to be on the road, where they were on Tuesday in Champaign, gave Illinois a good test down the stretch to make it a competitive game, but still came up short by 5, did cover as a 6.5-point road dog. But, Joe, the story for the Bruins, and Mick Cronin has made it pretty clear all year long, that Big Ten expansion leads to a lot of Big Ten travel. And UCLA and Big Ten play has not been great outside of the Pacific time zone. They are 9-1 in the Pacific time zone. That even includes road games in the Northwest or inside the Galen Center against USC. But, Joe, in the Central or Eastern time zones, where much of the Big Ten resides, UCLA is now 0-4 straight up. Indiana in the Midwest, and they're a slight home dog tonight against UCLA. How do you consider this blue blood battle playing out?
Yeah, I mean, I'm showing 0-5 in the Pacific, outside of the Pacific or Mountain time zones, Ben. So the problem is they've been in the Midwest now. This is the second game for them, as you mentioned there, against Illinois. So they've had some time here to assimilate and get used to the time change. And Cronin's been, he's been screaming and yelling from the beginning that it's just unfair what the schedule is. But give credit to Mick Cronin and UCLA. They have responded against adversity. A couple of months ago, all those trips out east, I mean, they were going through it. But this is a good team. This is a very, very good team that I think will not be surprised by any sort of zone defense that Indiana might throw at them like Michigan State was. I think UCLA is primed for a bounce back, and I think Indiana, listen, Woodson's leaving for a reason. I think they come back down to reality here, and ultimately UCLA will get its first win outside of those time zones.
There was a lot at stake on Tuesday night in East Lansing. There was an opportunity for Tom Izzo with a victory, which the odds makers expected the Spartans to have. Frankly, everybody did, understanding that Indiana was riding a 5-game skid. For Izzo to win Big Ten game number 354, moving past Bob Knight, the Indiana great, for the winningest head coach ever in Big Ten games in men's basketball history. Mike Woodson, for his former head coach when he was a player in Bloomington, had other ideas. Was that the peak for IU? Do they continue it back home inside Assembly Hall? And then maybe you saw that title, Blue Blood Battle. Are these guys crazy? They are blue bloods, both of them. UCLA, of course, the most national championships ever in men's Division I college basketball, 11. They haven't won one since 1995, but they do have 11. Indiana has 5. They haven't won one since 1987 under Bob Knight, but they also have 5. These two programs, 2 of the 6 programs at the D1 level in men's college hoops, with at least 5 national championships. More college basketball next. So some college basketball on this Friday night and a ton of college basketball this weekend. We have such a great slate of games tomorrow and even Sunday. And on Sunday, we will be 4 weeks out exactly from Selection Sunday, when an NCAA tournament bracket is unveiled. And Joe, tomorrow at 12:30 p.m. Eastern time on a Saturday afternoon, really before the entirety of the college hoops slate gets underway, the NCAA Tournament Selection Committee will come together to give us that sneak preview they have the past few years. The top 16 seeds, as they see it right now, for the big dance in just about a month. And it's starting to feel like these games are even more important, night in, night out, week over week. And Joe, tomorrow, we make some history. For the first ever time in SEC men's basketball, we have a matchup between the number 1 team in the AP poll and the number 2 team in the AP poll. And it's a rivalry now amplified. The Iron Basketball, if you will, between number 1 Auburn and number 2 Alabama. Tomorrow inside Coleman Coliseum, a 4 p.m. Eastern time tip is when we expect to get things underway between 1 versus 2. The line is already out. You don't often get lines for Saturday this early on a Friday morning unless the game is a monumental matchup, and that's what we have. The Tide, an ever so slight favorite at home, but it's basically a pick'em with an outlandishly high total of 171.5. That's what you have when you have Alabama, one of the best offenses in the country, and an Auburn team that, of course, can keep pace. Just to say what is at stake for this game, not just the first 1 versus 2 ever in the history of SEC men's basketball, our first 1 versus 2 in men's hoops since November 2021. Just our 5th 1 versus 2 game in the last decade in men's college basketball. And oh yeah, not only a rivalry between the Tigers and the Tide, but a game, Joe, that could decide the top spot in the SEC. With all of that history and all of that significance on the line tomorrow afternoon in Tuscaloosa, Joe, will the game match the hype?
Yeah, well, you got to think of, well, look at our total, Ben. Like 171.5. And I don't think people realize how unbelievably rare this is. They went to 64 teams, Ben, back in 1984 and 85 for the tournament. And since then, we've only had 16 regular season matchups between number 1 and number 2. The most recent was in 2021 when Gonzaga destroyed number 2 UCLA. But outside of that, we've only had 8 matchups that have actually ever come from the same conference. I mean, this is rarefied college basketball that we're going to get, where number 1 and number 2 are facing each other from the same conference at this point in the season here. And by the way, usually those 2 teams, or at least history tells us, they make a deep run in March here. None of them have ever won it, though, of those 16 games. No team has ever actually won it all, but boy, oh boy, they have made a run. And when you look at these 2 teams, man, number 1 and number 2 in offensive efficiency. That's why that total is the way it is. And don't forget, to start the season, Alabama couldn't hit a 3 if their life depended on it. Not so much anymore here, Ben. Now they're hitting almost 40% of their threes. They're now 40th in the country in three-point efficiency. I don't expect a lot of defense. I expect a lot of points in this game.
And last year, Joe, we knew that this was Alabama's style. It has been under Nate Oates. They attempt a lot of their shots from 3. They play at a very fast tempo, and they are elite on the offensive end. But last year, at the end of the NCAA tournament, Alabama ended 111th in adjusted defensive efficiency on KenPom. This year, they're 40th. They're never going to be an elite defense. Their style does not allow that to be the case. They don't play a half-court, grinded-out type of game. But to be better by 70 spots speaks lengths about what the Crimson Tide have done to shore up their defensive side of the floor. Auburn, most efficient offense, 17th most efficient defense. This will be just the 3rd game for the Tigers this year as an underdog. They won outright against Houston on the road, opening few weeks of the year. They did not cover against Duke inside Cameron Indoor before SEC play started. First game for the Tigers officially as an underdog within the SEC. Let's talk about the rest of our Saturday slate in college basketball next. What a Saturday and really weekend we have in college basketball. So many great games on Saturday, even a couple that we will see on Sunday. The weekend watch list, Joe, in total, 4 top 25 tilts. A couple of these tomorrow that we'll highlight, at least on this page. We also have 1 versus 2, so make that 5 top 25 tilts in total, ranked versus ranked, with a couple others that are also sensational. Some games tomorrow. a big one in the Big 12. Houston heads out to Tucson to take on Arizona. Wisconsin travels to Mackey to visit Purdue. The Boilermakers hoping to bounce back from a loss earlier this week on the road inside the Chrysler Center. Elsewhere in the SEC, a couple of rivalries tomorrow. 1 versus 2 between Auburn and Alabama. How about the Egg Bowl in basketball? Mississippi State visiting Oxford and Ole Miss. The Bulldogs struggling. They've dropped 6 of their last 9. And Joe, a game on Sunday afternoon inside Madison Square Garden between St. John's and Creighton that will decide the top spot in the Big East. The Johnnies saw their 10-game win streak come to a close earlier in the week at Villanova. Tyler Perkins burying a triple in the final 10 seconds of regulation to give the Cats the victory. Creighton saw its 9-game win streak snapped earlier in the week at home against UConn. Both teams trying to start a new streak, and the winner of that game will take over sole possession based on tiebreaker in the Big East come Sunday afternoon at the close inside the Mecca. It just speaks, Joe, to the strength of this weekend in college basketball, both Saturday and Sunday.
Yeah, I got to tell you, very interesting, a couple of these games. I think the Johnnies coming off a game against Villanova in which they took more threes than 2-point shots. I think there's going to be a big adjustment in that game for St. John's against Creighton. But that's a huge game for the Big East because the Johnnies win. They're firmly in control of that situation there. It's a big opportunity for Creighton here to go to Madison Square Garden and handle business. St. John's just doesn't shoot well enough for me. But the Houston and Arizona game, I think, is monstrous. I think this is the worst Tommy Lloyd Arizona team that he has had, and I think that's saying something here, Ben. But this Houston team is so different than what we've seen in years past with Coach Sampson, where we always knew they could play defense. It was offensively that worried you. They'd have to play these games, first one to 55, 60 would win. Well, not anymore. This is a team shooting 40% from 3 this year, Ben. This team is one of the best shooting teams in the country. Coupled with that defense, Houston's won 16 of its last 17 for a reason, Ben, and they are very much alive for a national championship this year.
They still play at a very slow tempo. That's what they do, 5th slowest in the country. This, Joe, is the only matchup between the Cougs and the Wildcats, the top 2 teams in the Big 12. Houston is 12-1. Arizona is 11-2. Arizona visited Kansas State earlier this week and learned how great of basketball the other Wildcats are playing. Jerome Tang's team has won 6 in a row and covered in 9 straight. Joe, to your point on Houston, great defensively, top 5. Yeah, that's what Kelvin Sampson does. 6th most efficient offense in the country. That is a recipe for success, not just within the Big 12, but deep, deep, deep into the Big Dance in a Final Four run. Houston, a little bit under the radar to start. I would not say any longer. Joe, where we stand right now, this early on a Friday morning, we don't have the odds out just yet on our lovely provider, the FanDuel Sportsbook, for most of those matchups, even the top 25 ranked versus ranked games that we have tomorrow. The only one we do as of this moment, 1 versus 2, Auburn versus Alabama. So we use the Ken Palm projections to try to get a feel of who's going to be favored, what the over-under is going to look like. Ken Palm has Houston winning by 3 tomorrow in Tucson, so we would expect the Cats to be a slight underdog at home. Big bounce-back spot for Purdue against the Wisconsin team that can really light it up offensively this year. Again, the Bulldogs from Starkville, Mississippi State, dropped 6 of their last 9, Joe. They've only covered once in that span. Ole Miss playing better basketball. Creighton and St. John's important because St. John's is most recent loss before earlier this week on Wednesday against Villanova came against Creighton in Omaha. And then the Johnnies went on that 10-game win streak. So if St. John's does falter inside Madison Square Garden, they'll be a slight home favorite, of course, against the Jays. Creighton would have the season series sweep and have that tiebreaker advantage, but both teams would have the same record within the Big East. So very important jockeying here as we are about 4 weeks away from Selection Sunday. Joe, only really about 6, 7, 8 games remaining in conference action for these teams before we get to conference tournaments, and then, of course, the weekend that will decide the bracket.
Yeah, it's crunch time here, Ben. Some of these teams, certainly some of the teams on the bubble who need some wins and need them desperately. This is the time of year, Ben, where you can really find some value, especially in those one-and-done conferences, Ben. We got a lot of them here where teams, well, they need to win their conference tournament or they need to finish up at the top in order to give themselves a chance to go dancing. I think it's going to be fascinating to see with all of these readjusted and alignment and these conferences, some of the names that are going to be left out this year, Ben, I think are going to be staggering.
And you look at the bubble because of what we have seen throughout conference play, it's not exactly the strongest or firmest bubble we have seen in recent years. Duke continues to run roughshod through the ACC. They bounced back from their loss last Saturday at Clemson with a 21-point win against Cal. The Berkeley Bears did cover as a 23.5-point road dog. Duke gets Stanford, who has been good at times this year in the ACC under Kyle Smith in his first year in Palo Alto, but now they have dropped 3 of their last 4. Tennessee hoping to bounce back from a loss earlier in the week insider up against Kentucky. They host Vanderbilt. Keep an eye on Texas A&M, playing great ball right now under Buzz Williams. Getting an Arkansas team, Joe. The Razorbacks playing better in the last 2 weeks. That should be a really good game. Michigan State and Illinois tomorrow night, 8 p.m. Eastern on Fox. One of my favorite games of the day. The Illini not ranked, but I think if you were to look at them, you would consider them one of the 20 or 25 best teams in the country. That should be a great one. The Spartans looking to stay atop the Big Ten standings to rival their biggest rival in Michigan, who heads to Columbus on Sunday afternoon for a very big game in that rivalry between the Wolverines and the Buckeyes. And Kentucky hoping to keep it going tomorrow afternoon in Austin against Texas.
Yeah, I mean, listen, that was a huge win for Dusty May and Michigan coming back there against Purdue. Now the question is, can they build off of that? Or are they going to go to Ohio State and get pummeled? And that's the fear that you have with this Michigan team. I think Arkansas has finally figured some things out. I think that is going to be maybe the more interesting matchup of the weekend. Can they put a string together of some wins against some ranked teams? And then all of a sudden, Calipari very firmly in the mix.
They've won 3 of their last 4, Joe, including that return for Coach Cal 2 Saturdays ago to Lexington and Rupp Arena. The only loss last Saturday at home to Alabama, but only by 4 points. It wasn't a disastrous effort by any means. Again, we don't have the odds out for any of these games outside of 1 versus 2, Auburn and Alabama tomorrow. Certainly not the Sunday games. But Michigan is projected right now to lose by 2 points against Ohio State. That could be one of those weird phenomenons in college basketball where the unranked home team and the Buckeyes are a home favorite.